This module is about water and wastewater. The first thing we need to discuss here is the lake or river ecosystem. Why? Because lake and river are considered to be the drainage basin or the catchment area or the watershed for a particular industrial plant. Basically, we get our water from either a river or a lake near the industrial plant. In the same manner, we consider the lake or a river or any body of water as a disposal medium of the wastewater generated from an industrial plant. And therefore, it is important to know the study of the physical, chemical, biological characteristics of rivers and basins, which we call limnology. In limnology, you have to consider different organisms that exist in the river, one of which would be the benthic organism. This refers to plant or an animal that lives at or near the bottom of a lake, a river system, or an ocean. This basically would be the ones would interact with the contaminants or the pollutants that would be coming from your contaminated water. Then also you have to consider the different points within the vertical strata of the river. We have the euphotic zone. This refers to the surface volume of water in the ocean or a deep lake that receives sufficient light to support photosynthesis. Whether the quality of the water that you discharge be affecting this area would tell you the impact of that particular wastewater. Then you also have your compensation point. This refers to the water level where algal photosynthesis is reduced to the point that it only just matches respiration. Again, it is correlated to the characteristic of water that you discharge in this particular ecosystem basin. The different strata of a river or a lake would be as follows. So you have the epilimnion, hypolimnion, the metalimnion. Now, what is important is for you to know the temperature gradient of which, because this is where we want to eliminate the occurrence of thermocline. What's thermocline? It's the occurrence of rapid vertical change in temperature with development of stratification. For the different layers, as mentioned, the delta T would vary. Now, a drastic change would have an impact to the ecosystem present in each layer. An example of an impact that would occur because of the occurrence of thermocline would be the fish kill. So if the dissolved oxygen would be affected, the concentration of the dissolved oxygen be affected because of the change in temperature, you would have that phenomenon of fish kill. The different ecosystem in the different layers of the lake or river would include several organisms, the flora and the fauna, that has the following components. So you may have the planktons, you may also have the macrophytes. Then our interest here would be whether we will be having an algal bloom. An algal bloom would then lead to another phenomenon which we would like to prevent, and that is eutrophication. In the latter part of the lecture, we will be discussing this phenomenon. Another important thing for engineers like you is to consider hydrologic cycle. I guess you're still familiar with your water cycle, or we call as hydrologic cycle. This figure shows you the different processes that are involved in hydrologic cycle. Now, what is it in you as a chemical engineer? Why do you need to study this? Because you're supposed to come up with the water budget. Water budget is defined as the model that balances the inputs, outputs, and storage of water in a system. Now, going back to your hydrologic cycle, you have here the surface runoff Now, the surface runoff would either infiltrate through the subsurface flow and would be part of the bodies of water, but some of it would also percolate through the different layers of the sediments. This water that percolates through the different levels or the different layers of the sediments would then go to an area which we call aquifer. Aquifer is an underground zone or body of earth material from which groundwater can be obtained from a well at a useful rate. Technically, because the water has been filtered already with some of the unnecessary materials, technically the water that you get, which is we call the groundwater, is relatively clean. Now, these can just be disinfected in industry, and then right after you have pumped it out from the deep well, you can just disinfect it and then ready for usage. Now, what is important for us, since this is the most common source of water in industry, what is important is this: we watch another phenomenon to occur, or we want to eliminate the occurrence of another phenomenon which we call cone of depression. Cone of depression happens when the rate of discharge in the aquifer would be higher or very, very high as compared to the rate of recharge. So you notice in the figure, as you keep on pumping out the water that would add to the rate of discharge, you are actually forming a cone. That's why it's called cone of depression. And as you form the cone, you continue to put pressure, you continue to have higher pump rating, you're actually having the cone bigger. And as you do that, what happens to the aquifer is that it keeps on decreasing. And as you decrease, you may even reach the bottom part of the aquifer, and then sometimes, or what will happen is that you no longer pump the water, but you pump the sediments in the soil instead. That phenomenon is called cone of depression. Before we proceed with the different water quality parameters, let's consider first the importance of discussing this. In discussing the water quality parameters, we can already connect it to your engineering unit operations and unit processes. How? By just knowing what is occurring in the system or in your unit process or unit operation, you can already predict what water quality parameter will be affected. This would be very significant because you would learn later that there are 35 water quality parameters to consider. Let's say you are a consultant and you would like to address a particular problem in an industry. What would you do? Would you ask the owner or the proponent of the project to have an analysis of all these 35 water quality parameters? Definitely not, because it's unsustainable. So, there is a need for us to predict what is the unit operation, processes, effects on the water quality. Let's take these examples. For example, if I have a power plant, what do you think would be the water quality that would be affected? Yes, you're correct. That's temperature. Then, if you have an industrial plant, what would be the water quality parameter that would be affected? Well, it all depends on what kind of industrial plant. Let's say it's a noodle manufacturing company. What do you know about noodles? Noodles are made up of organic components. And therefore, if you deplete the organic waste, you would be affecting a water quality parameter, which is the biochemical oxygen demand. As chemical engineers, we're interested in surface water pollution. Why? Because we normally discharge the wastewater coming from industrial plants to these bodies of surface water, namely rivers or lakes. Aside from that, the groundwater that we normally utilize for industrial processes are already depleting. So the current trend now is what we call surface water abstraction. That is, we get the water resources from these bodies of surface water, namely the lake and the river. So we consider the water quality of the surface water, and this is defined in terms of the physical, chemical, and biological characterization of the water. Now, why do we need to classify the water quality? Because normally, when we go to treatment, you would realize that the water quality parameter that is affected would give you an idea what kind of treatment are we going to make use of. That is, if you have water quality in terms of physical, chemical, and biological characterization, the treatment could also be classified as physical treatment, biological treatment, or chemical treatment. To consider the water quality, first and foremost, let's have some definition of terms. When you have a wastewater treatment plant, whatever water that you get out of the process and put it into the WWTP, or the wastewater treatment plant, is known to be the influent. While after treating for an appropriate treatment, the wastewater is now considered as an effluent. So we are after, let's say, you just want to discharge the wastewater into a body of river or a body of lake, you are after the effluent standard.